What is going on, guys? It's been over 5 months now and I'm finally ready to do my GRX Di2 review. There is a lot to cover, so let's not waste any time. Let's go for it right now. Here it is, the Shimano GRX Di2. They've taken a little bit of road, a little bit of mountain bike, dipped into their spare parts bucket and put together a superb gravel group set. Here's my test rig for the last few months, a Bossy Grit TI. It's sleek, clean, and beautiful. On the GRX, it's not quite perfect, but it's pretty damn close. Let's talk about it. And being a group set, let's start with the shifting. And it's classic Di2, super reliable, extremely consistent, and very accurate. It's not what you'd call lightning fast in sort of out-of-the-box setting. I think a well-sorted mechanical drivetrain will race through a cassette faster than this will. But the magic of Di2 is that it always does exactly what you want when you tell it to. You just mash a button and the drivetrain will make it happen. Doesn't matter if you're doing a full power effort or anything else where you shouldn't shift, Di2 will do it for you anytime you ask. So from that perspective, it doesn't change much, but there's been some hardware tweaks for GRX Di2 that are really fantastic. The shifter top buttons from the road group sets have sort of moved to the inside of the hood and sort of slightly above where your thumb sits, which is a great place to have it because it's much more accessible. Being a 1x group set and I didn't have a D-fly or anything like that, I had very simple requirements for what I wanted the buttons to do. So using the Shimano eTube software, I had all of the shifting remapped to do the same thing basically. So all of the buttons on the right shifter move the chain to the right, all the buttons to the left shifter move the chain to the left. So pretty much all I had to do was just flail at the shifter with whichever hand and it would just happen. That sneaky little button actually became a favorite way to shift for me because you're just rolling along the road, lift your thumb a little bit, give it a squeeze and it shifts for you. You don't have to release your grip and I really like that. So the shifting is the familiar brilliance of Di2 with a few little tweaks that are really nice for gravel riding and you know what, for all riding. Let's hope they move that shift button for the road group set as well because it's just a great place to have it. Next thing is the ergonomics, and in short, they're the best hydraulic shifters I've ever laid hands on. The way they've sculpted and shaped the shifters is superb. The flat section where you rest your hands has been elongated. There's a new, slightly altered texture to them, and the levers themselves have been subtly reshaped. I absolutely love them. They even suit being angled well, which is very important in the age of gravel handlebars. This is something that's better than SRAM. I've found that once you put the SRAM shifters on an angle, they suddenly get a fair bit less comfortable because they're a bit blocky. That is just the mechanical, not the electronic stuff, which I will be using soon. From an ergonomic perspective, these are better than anything Shimano's done before, and really better than anything anyone's done before. Even the Campagnolo system, which I'm a big fan of, doesn't compete with GRX Di2 for ergonomics. Brilliant work. The braking system has been redesigned for GRX Di2 with some inspiration taken from mountain bike, a few tweaks to the internals, and the results are brilliant. Inside the lever, they've moved the brake pivot higher, which gives you better leverage when you're braking from the hoods. They've also redesigned the servo based on what they know from their mountain biking systems. The end result is more powerful braking with better modulation, with less input from your hands, which is a great result. The rest of the parts in the braking system aren't new, but because they've made improvements inside the shifter, the whole system feels like it's been changed and improved. Better modulation and better power at the same time. I'm very happy to report as well that I had basically silent braking with this system. All I ever got was a quiet whoosh when I was on the brakes. When things got wet, I got a slightly louder whoosh, still very quiet. An important caveat though was that this frame was prepared for building with a full facing done on the brake mount points, so they were perfectly flat, which allows for perfect alignment and generally better brake performance overall. That is a really important part of having quiet brakes. So if your frame has been prepped properly, then the GRX brakes will be absolutely whisper quiet, which is fantastic. Maintenance has been minimal. I had the front brake re-bled because I think there was a little bubble in there that was kind of making the power come and go a little bit. That seems to have been fine now after the bleed. And there's still a little bit under 50% left in the pads, which is pretty good after 1,500 kilometers with plenty of that done in the wet. It's actually quite a good wear rate. The rear derailleur is where things start to get interesting in both a good and less good sort of way. It's another development of the Shadow design, which manages to be quite minimal despite its size. There's also the clutch, which I've had some issues with. Let's start with the shape of the rear derailleur, and Shimano has again sort of evolved their shadow profile. It's quite a large rear derailleur, but they've done some clever design to make it have a low sort of external profile. So when it's fully sort of collapsed and is sitting on the smallest cog, as far out as it will go, it sort of doesn't sit too far outboard of the bike, which is great because it protects the derailleur and it protects the hanger, so things are less likely to knock it, and if it takes a tumble on its drivetrain side, it's probably just going to protect it that little bit more, which is great because it's an expensive drivetrain. And also, I've bent so many goddamn hangers in my time, it's nice to see any little design that might prevent that in future. Now we have to move on to the one part of the drivetrain I did have some problems with, and that is the clutch. For starters, it's a little bit slack straight out of the box. So after a few weeks, I did have it tightened up because I was getting quite a lot of chain slap onto the chainstay. That did improve things, but there is a bigger issue with the clutch, and it's to do with the switch. It kind of has a bad habit of wandering out of position, which I will show you now.
So here's what I'm talking about with the clutch kind of wandering a bit out of position. It should be here, where it says on, as you can see there. When it's off, it's sort of down here. But it kind of like drops behind, and as you can see, there's a little bit of rub on the cage there. And this happens just during riding. Like, I think this is maybe the third or fourth time I've noticed it. Like, you can get it out, but I don't really get why it's there.
So I took the bike into my fantastic mechanic, Biomechanic Cycles and Repairs, to get his thoughts on what might be causing this. And he did a full strip down to see what was going on inside. The problem seems to be with a lack of tightness on the clutch switch itself. It's allowed to sort of wobble inboard and outboard of the frame, as well as sort of its regular switch movement left and right. So when the derailleur is at full extension, when I'm on the granny gear, it just sort of slots in behind the derailleur body, and it stays there until you pull it out, which is quite fiddly to do. It's still on, but it's very tricky to get it out of there. So my mechanic Pete decided to put just a tiny little washer behind the clip that keeps the switch in place. All that's meant to do is fill up that gap just a little bit and reduce the amount of play, which it does seem to have done successfully. So far, it has been behaving a bit better, but it'll need a few more rides before I will call it a success. Just to be clear, I absolutely do not recommend people crack open their Shimano rear derailleurs, or any rear derailleur for that matter, and start playing around with what's inside. I took mine to a very experienced mechanic with decades of work on Shimano stuff, so I trusted him to sort of do the right thing in a responsible way. Don't void your warranties by playing with stuff yourself, people. If you have problems, take it to your mechanic. Another thing of interest with the clutch is how it adds drag to the drivetrain. So when it's up on the servicing stand and you have the clutch on, you can feel just a little bit of resistance as you pedal through the gears. Obviously, this disappears into the pedaling effort when you're actually on the bike, but it's something interesting to note. If you turn the clutch off, it gets a lot smoother. So that's a little way in which Shimano is not quite matching SRAM. I find SRAM derailleurs tend to have a less aggressive clutch, maybe because you can't switch it off. It just adds a little bit less friction into the drivetrain. Just something to keep an eye on and something to know. The rest of the drivetrain is filled out from the Shimano parts bucket. Most of the perishables, cassettes, chains, and brake pads are existing Shimano assets, which is great because there's a ton of choice across a few price points. You can even mix road and GRX parts together, which I've seen on a few builds, and it is fantastic. All this means that Shimano GRX is going to be cheaper and easier to live with over time. I love that they didn't reinvent everything for this group set. They refined and adapted things that were necessary to improve things for the target application, and they kind of used existing assets that were already plenty good enough. That means there's a big range of parts and there's a big range of prices across parts. Compare this to the SRAM ETAP AXS system, and that's not at all the case. You have new proprietary bottom bracket, free hub, and you've got quite expensive chains and cassettes that you have to replace when yours wear out. Gravel and adventure riders tend to favor simplicity and cheapness and, are a little bit conservative with their choice of equipment, which is absolutely understandable. I am too. So I think that suits the target market really well. Great move, Shimano. I do have a slight philosophical problem with the GRX 1x though. I don't love the gear range that the 1x gives you. It just doesn't feel very 2020, and personally I'd much prefer a 2x. Shimano made the choice to max out the rear derailleur of the 1x at 42 teeth, which is a missed opportunity because they have a perfectly good 1146 in their lineup. I just don't feel like 1142 is really the range that I want. One of the great strengths of 1x is that it's simple, but without the range to back it up, it starts to get a little bit less appealing. With GRX, there is a 2x alternative, and because the 1x doesn't give that diverse range that I want, I would much rather have the 2x. Don't forget as well, it's Shimano. The front shifting is brilliant with Shimano stuff. I haven't used the GRX, but I think it's a pretty safe assumption that it's going to be very good on the 2x setup. So that's just a small limiting factor for me with the 1x. So let's tie this all together. Shimano has made a truly superb group set with GRX Di2. The shifting, ergonomics, and braking are brilliant. The group set is easy to whack onto your bike and doesn't take any proprietary new parts. It's not cheap, with the group set presented here coming in at a little over 3,000 Australian dollars. But for those with the money, it comes very highly recommended. Riding with GRX Di2 is an absolute pleasure. It just lets you get on with enjoying your ride and just doesn't make a fuss. Now there are some issues, as I've shown you, with the way the clutch switch has been designed, but this is such new tech, I'm not really sure whether that's indicative of just my derailleur or whether there's a greater sort of design problem with that. Only time will tell. Other than that, this is a really fantastic group set. We waited a long time to get it, but Shimano has really nailed it in so many ways that really matter to this type of riding and to this type of rider. That's where I'm going to leave it, guys. Thank you so much for joining me. I've got links to the written review in the description below if you want to see more about this group set. Thank you for joining me. As always, like, subscribe, all that sort of stuff. It really helps me out. I hope this review has been valuable to anyone who is thinking of investing in this drivetrain. Thank you, and I will see you next time. Ride safe and stay healthy.